Hi guys, what I want to talk about today is something that's come up in training lately, and as we've been running a lot of events in our area, some things that have come up and something that I think could be helpful, especially to inexperienced dogs. And that is the topic of dealing with scent and drag back scent at events, and then how to mimic that in training. When I say drag back, for those of you that aren't familiar with that term, I mean if you're dog 25 at an event, there's been 24 dogs that have run before you that has been dragging bird scent through the field or over the dike to get back in the water, over the island to get back in the water. You basically have scent that the dog is having to deal with, that when you're training by yourself or with a very small group, that the dog does not get to experience. So, and it can cause the dog to end up hunting on a mark or having trouble on a blind because it starts to hunt an area where it thinks the bird is, and it hasn't had enough experience to realize what the difference is between drag back scent and where the bird really is. And again, it can cause trouble, especially for inexperienced dogs, and even if they get the mark, it can really affect their score because it causes them to put up a much bigger hunt than they normally would. So it's fairly common to see a dog that hasn't had much experience training with a larger group and dealing with drag back scent, that when it comes across these, especially in specific situations, let's say it's swimming in some water, has to cross a dike and re-enter the water, and on that dike it's heavily scented with birds crossing back and forth, that the dogs will get up there and hunt that. And especially when you get into doubles and triples, when a dog isn't totally sure maybe where the bird is, when that nose kicks in, it's going to immediately hunt there. Even though it may not even think totally that that's where it is, but if their nose tells it it is, they will begin the hunt there. And only experience will show them that, okay, maybe I'll hunt there, it's not there, and then continue on. And then eventually just to cross right over it when that applies. So I'm going to give a very simple example here of how this works and how you can work on it in training, even if you're training by yourself or with a small group. Let's say this is our line, and let's say in between here, this is a dike, and in between the dike and the line is water. And then there's another piece of land here, and then there's a thrower throwing into some light cover here. It's not very far retrieved. Let's say it's 75 yards, 50 yards, whatever the case may be. Obviously, the longer it is, the more difficult it could be. And the closer that this dike is to the actual mark could cause some difficulty because the dogs start to think that's where it is because it's so close to where it is. I hope that makes sense. So in this case, let's say the dike's halfway there. So your dog 25, your dog gets to this point, and right at the dike, 24 dogs have now crossed back over there dragging duck scent. And you have an inexperienced dog, and it begins to hunt this. And maybe it hunts there and never does recover. Maybe it hunts there and eventually jumps in the water and goes and finds this. Either way, it's affected your score. If it's a double or a triple and they're not totally sure where it is, they may hunt here and never get out of there. So again, it's going to really affect your score. And if this is a blind retrieve, your dog goes to cross this, smells the bird and starts to hunt, you stop, say back, the dog starts to go back and then starts to hunt again because it's not used to dealing with this scent. You may have 3 or 4 cast refusals or more before you get the dog back in the water. And depending on the judge and the situation, that could cost you a ribbon. So this kind of thing really can affect a dog. I've even seen it affect dogs running the master level that have passed a lot of tests in certain situations. Dogs that have had a lot of training, but just haven't had a lot of experience with dealing with the drag back scent, really, other than events, because the training when they train it, they're not exposed to that frequently enough. Now, some dogs are so good they're going to deal with it, and it may affect their score, but it's still going to be good enough to pass. Other dogs, it's going to affect their score to the point where maybe they don't end up getting a ribbon from it. So we want to prevent that if we can. So then what do you do if you're training by yourself or it's just 1 or 2 people? What I suggest people do is you artificially put drag back scent out. So take a dead bird and drag scent in here as if there had been dogs crossing over it. Maybe wet the duck and, put scent there. And then do that frequently enough in training so the dog begins to experience that and knows the difference between what drag back is and where the real mark fell. And if you're having real trouble, you can do these as singles and shorten them up so they realize how to do that. I mean, if they're constantly just getting hung up on here, you can simplify by doing it as a single or shortening up the mark so they believe their eyes more readily because it's obvious it did not land right here. What you don't want to do is make this so difficult either in distance or make it a memory bird where the dog isn't totally sure where the bird is, which is back here, so it's more apt to hunt here when you're teaching it. Now later, of course, we'll have to deal with that in the most demanding situations. As they get better at it, then you can make the retrieves farther, make them multiples, etc. But at the beginning, you want to make it clear that dealing with this, you want to make it clear where the mark is so they're more apt to cross this. And then we begin to challenge them a little bit more as they start to experience how to solve the problem. And I try to, in training, if at all possible, is to, even if they get hung up on here, is to try to let them solve it themselves and choose to re-enter here on their own instead of me just immediately handling them if it's a handling dog or having the gunner yell immediately. And that can vary on the dog, I mean depending on the dog, but normally if I feel at least, if they can problem solve this, I have a better chance of them actually learning the difference between what their nose is telling them with the drag back versus what their eyes is telling them the mark is. And usually once they start to do that, then they're more apt to cross over and get this bird. And there are going to be times where, you know, they think that's where the bird is and they start to hunt there, not just because of the drag back, but that's because where they think it is. And if they don't find it there, you would like them to be willing to look beyond that or come in a little or whatever, but to leave this area to search somewhere else. And I believe they're more apt to do that if they've problem solved that themselves in training. Now again, if I'm having a dog that just isn't getting it, I'll handle it, or I could even have the gunner help and pull them on out of there. But eventually, I feel that if I can get the dog to problem solve it, I'm going to be better off. And it's not about never ever having them get hung up and drag back at all, because again, if this mark is 150 yards and this dike is closer to the mark, and the dog actually thinks it's there, you don't want him to think every dike it hunts or every island it hunts or every time it hits some scent that it's supposed to just blow by it. But you want them to be willing, if they think it's there, to put up a little hunt, but then to readily leave that and proceed back further if necessary. So again, it's not just blow past this dike every time, or necessarily always blow past where they think the bird is if there's some drag back there, but to be willing to go further if necessary. And if you do this consistently enough, they will start to get it. So I hope this helps. I see this frequently, and it's something that people that, again, that train by themselves who are with a small group just aren't exposed to a lot of this drag back. So again, we put out scent even in our large groups a lot of times before the first dog runs, even if we're going to have 20 dogs that run, just so everybody can experience the drag back. And then we try to change our running order often enough so everybody gets to deal with being the last dog to run or the middle dog to run versus one of the first dogs to run when there's not as much drag back out there. And as you begin to do this, you'll start to see your dog improve and start to differentiate between using its nose and believing its eyes. And again, the nose is important, but we want them to differentiate between the two. Rarely do I use pressure here, especially at the early stages, if they really think the bird's there, because you don't want them to, every time they get into scent, just to blow through it because pressure's been put on them. There are times with dogs that just never get this and they always get hung up and have trouble with it, that you could use pressure, but that would be way down the road. And again, I want to point out too, we're not talking about a dog that's hunting this dike because it's refusing to get in this back piece of water. That's a whole different story. We're talking about a dog that is just getting caught in the drag back. This could be land even. So that's a whole different situation, not re-entering the water because it's trying to avoid the water. So I hope that helps. Thanks.